Great pleasure to introduce Professor David MACHIN, who is a very known scholar in the field of multimodality studies, but also working on critical discourse analysis. His books are very well known and very well read for all those who have an interest in these topics. I should like just to mention Visual Journalism 2015, Doing Visual Analysis 2018, and an Introduction to Multimodal Analysis, which was very relevant in the field, of course, 2020, and recently also just published, I think, 2023, How to Do Critical Discourse Analysis. David is also notably the co-editor of the peer-reviewed Taylor and Francis journal Social Semiotics, which publishes papers, as you know, in the fields of the discourse analysis, but also critical multimodal studies, and also the editor of the Bloomsbury Books series Advances in Critical Discourse Studies. Please welcome Professor MACHIN for this presentation that I'm sure is going to be very exciting. Professor MACHIN, the floor is yours.
This is my first real semiotics conference. I've been to a few small events in Sweden where I didn't really know what people were talking about. But what I was aware of was the incredible technical skills with handling signs. You know, the incredible, I don't know, like the plenary that preceded me, just the kind of, the skills to look deeper into communication, which I think is evidence of a huge tradition spanning many, many decades. When I started editing social semiotics back in, I think it's about 2002-03 with Paul Cobley, we were two communication scholars, and Paul was doing semiotics, and I was doing multimodality. And it's kind of interesting, but this time he said, when we talked to Nikolai, you should come to this conference. You should come. I said, well, when I go, I don't know what to say. I'm afraid to say anything because these guys, they know a lot. These people are smart, And I just do critical discourse analysis. I just say, look, that's a bit of politics and that's bad. Yeah. And then this time I come in, people are doing multimodality as well. And I think the one thing that my thought is, like multimodality, and then I remember Kay, we went to an event, was it 2018, just before the John Bainman in Bremen, and it was a multimodality conference before the pandemic, and it was about, multimodality has now been going for a long time, and it's become lots and lots of different things. And I still think, nevertheless, it can learn a lot from semiotics, an awful lot. Multimodalities, to say like people like me, are kind of linguists who discovered late those images. Linguists that say, oh, there's films, and they communicate as well, do they? And then some of you have already sort of done like a degree or PhD in film studies like 30 years ago or something. And I guess, all that occurred to me is, maybe I can just show what my version of doing multimodality is and how and why I do it. And maybe that will, one hand, reveal some of my limitations, but also like how I think I can apply the semiotic sort of multimodal knowledge that I do have to my project. And I think, when I look at some of these presentations, fantastic presentations that I've seen so far, and I just hope that people who know semiotics don't over-romanticize multimodality and sort of forget what they already know. The knowledge, the rich knowledge that goes back sort of decades. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about what I do and how I do multimodality and what I do with it. I think in this conference, with Kay is a very different multimodality to me. And there's John Bateman, he does something different. And we have someone who's doing gesture studies. So we're all doing very different things with very different aims. So when we say we do multimodality, it's kind of a sort of maturing field in its own right. So what are we doing? And why are we using multimodality? And there's a danger sometimes in papers that I get sent to review that just like multimodality, and then there's a list of sort of 10 texts, Preston van Leuven, Kyle Halloran, David Machin. I think, but we do really different stuff. what do you mean by this? What is this? So, and I think, like I just sat in on these guys talking about face. I'm just learning. But I sometimes just worry when people say, I'm now doing multimodality, that you go, wait a second, aside. Well, let me just tell you what I do, and I'm going to look at a small example. Like I do critical discourse analysis and use multimodality. What I sort of do to those of you who know about critical discourse analysis, it's always as a bit of an activist, really. For example, I'm doing one project that's been running for about 5 years. But actually, I work with a Romanian colleague, and we've written a lot on racism against the Roma in Europe, like economic migrants and the horrible way that they are presented. And we publish and we try to engage with and learn from people who write in racism studies. So we publish in journals like what ethnicities and racism. So I guess, what can I, as a communications scholar, contribute to their knowledge, and what can I learn from them? And often what I can communicate is a tiny little bit. But I guess what we can show is, and I think which is acknowledged, is that sometimes, for example, like say with racism, it can be quite hidden and buried and subtle. We can all say, look, here's a picture of a Nazi, on social media. We don't need a semiotician or multimodality to do that. But what happens, maybe you can say something and combine it with images in a flowchart that has the implications that there's something racist. So I guess that's what we do, in terms of these conferences and say, on racism, or we present on the Roman and say, well, there's these kind of elements of the communication that you might not pick up. And so, for example, we had some meetings with Facebook who were interested in this. How can you, is racism always obvious? And what can you as communications scholars, as semioticians, as multimodal scholars, what can you show us that we're missing, that's not obvious, that's kind of concealed? Because, you can show things in images that you can't say because they're ambiguous. You can show a photograph of a woman in a burqa, and you can sort of suggest that, and now underneath say Muslims are doing something. In language you haven't said all Muslims look like this, but this can be the effect of such repetition of images. For example, to a very crude example. And so this research, the idea is also then to have events where we meet with like NGOs and with policymakers. So it's a kind of activism, but I think it's like it demands us to say, what do we offer? What do we bring as communication scholars? And I just wanted to do one short example today. And this is something, a paper I just wrote for a very academic journal called Discourse and Society. And this is a project, and it's basically something that my wife is really interested in. And she's actually presenting her version of this paper at the moment at a political communication conference in Amsterdam. Perhaps now, actually. She's there doing her version of things. And it's a conference about democracy and the dangers of social media for democracy and what we do and don't talk about now. How we communicate the dangers that are in our societies and how does social media change this, how does it shift this. So this is the example of that. And it's inspired from some friends we had while we were living in Sweden who were refugees, who were arguing about things and telling us about things that were invisible to me. And I suppose I wondered as a communication scholar, what it was that I could say about this. I think some of you here know far much more about social media than me. But I think what I can show is just how, as a scholar, I can engage in critical discourse studies using multimodality with a particular body of literature, or even to combine two bodies of literature. And I think that is one important strand of multimodality. And I wondered about that in some of the papers that I saw over the last 2 days, where what kind of multimodality does this need to be? Is it one where we're modelling, say, like the text that we see? Do we want to create a grammar of like text and image relations? Or do we want to engage with, say, discussions about democracy? And if we do, what kind of scholars are already doing that? And what can we contribute, if anything? I often find I can communicate tiny little things, but just something. And maybe I can just show you that. So this is about a hashtag that was trending in 2021. It's called Stand Living in Afghanistan. And it was filled with people making hand gestures. And this person's written on their tweet, women around the world stand with women in Afghanistan. I think people in the popular media talk about what is it with these gestures where we stand for things. We stand against racism, or we stand for things like this example, like the classic Banoche thing. I cut my hair, to stand with women in Iran. Other examples. There's a famous one from the Bring Back Our Girls, and we have the Lady Obama. So you stand. So lots of people do this. In some sense, I guess a friend who's a semiotician, he's called this classic sort of indexicality. You stand in the space of someone. You use this emblematic gesture, and you sort of stand in the space with them. But I suppose it's a critical discourse analysis. I wonder what does this mean, say, for democratic communication? What does it mean for how we talk about things in society? As a critical discourse analyst, it's all about what kinds of discourses dominate the way we tend to think about things. What kind of issues of injustice do we see? Do we share? What kind of ways of fighting injustice become legitimised, become considered reasonable? And this is one that was big. I saw this in the UK media, which was about this One Love emblem. And I saw on the news, the football news feed, it became a big issue of who was wearing the One Love emblem or not. And people were saying, why are you not wearing this One Love emblem? Those of you who don't know or care about football, this was to do with the Qatar World Cup. So this symbol was a challenge to Qatar for their gender policies and use of slave labour. So in a way we didn't do anything to change it, but we have a symbol. And then some sports people who didn't wear it were sort of saying, why are you not wearing this? And I've actually been in a similar situation just in an academic network where, I'm lazy with social media, where people are asking me, why did you not tweet about this? Why did you not do that? Do you not agree? So I don't say that I agree. Does that mean I don't? But people were worried about it. And because I don't look at social media, I missed a kind of whole argument about me, and about kind of questioning my morality about this. What does that mean? And I talked about clusters of other people who weren't doing things as a type of person. So there's this kind of thing, and I'll ignore that one. I play some jazz, and I go on music sites where you share musical resources. And one interesting about Ukraine here, lots of sort of people on it started to use the Ukraine emblems, mainly the American people on this site. So they started to use the Ukrainian flag. So it's a sort of gesture. What does that do? And some of these people, they're really nice, but when I ask them, they don't know anything about it. They don't know even that their country is partly, it's very much involved in this as a dispute. But yeah, they feel like somehow it's just and it's I don't know, it's just against suffering and against war. But, if we all support Ukraine in this way, what does that mean? What would happen if I put, say, a Russian flag up there, as a symbol of being saying, I also want to remember that this is a broader situation, or I also want to remember that America have responsibility here. I would be kicked off the site. So clearly some emblems and some sort of gestures are required or not. What does this mean for how we then are obliged to express political opinions, and what can you not say? So back to the women in Afghanistan. So there was lots of this sort of stuff on the hashtag. And most of it's dead now, it's gone. But we collected everything while it was running. And it was the time when, it started the time when the American forces, after 20 years, pulled out of Kabul. And this, if that means, like most of the coverage of Afghanistan, it was completely decontextualised and mysterious, and no one actually knew what was happening. But there's these scenes of the airport, it's filled with people, panic and people falling from aircrafts. And that was one way that the news reported it. But it also immediately went into this kind of mode of reporting. So the Taliban say they will preserve women's rights under Sharia law. What does that mean? So it became, the only way of representing it became about women. It became about the Taliban. And I suppose what I want to think about today is just what does the literature on social movements, on social media tell me? What can I get from that? But also think about the reality. What is Afghanistan? What happens there? And what gets missed if we do this whole idea of focusing on women? And by standing next to women, what becomes deleted and erased? So there was lots of this kind of stuff. Many critics have said that the burqa was used by the Americans, as a legitimation to go to war against the barbaric forces of the Taliban. Lots of this stuff. So then we had lots of people on the. So our New York staff stands in solidarity with Afghan women. Show your solidarity by using the hashtag. And what the literature would argue is this is a complete misunderstanding of the situation of women in Afghanistan. This is not really how to even help women. By doing this, distracts from the actual problems. So you had also this sort of stuff, people wearing, because at the time of the COVID, wearing a face mask to show solidarity with brave Afghan women, free a face. So this idea again about solidarity setting, so what's the solution here? What's being offered? But also I think for me also what is deleted? What is erased by foregrounding this? And what we know is that the mass media now, the mainstream media, they draw on and are inspired by and lean on social media. So these are the kind of discourses that often get raised because it's easy reporting. Look at this hashtag that's trending, and this becomes the definer of the news. So Taliban forcing women and news presenters in Afghanistan to cover their faces in a cruel and blatant violation of basic human rights. And it's also interesting that when you look into the literature, the Taliban kind of vanish. Like, it's hard to tell who the Taliban were. And if the Taliban even had much effect broadly over the country, at least not compared to the chaos caused by the American occupation. And even, like you see the UN, the EU rather, they lowered their flag in solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. That must have made a huge comfort for them, I imagine. Like if I was in Afghanistan, I've suffered like 50 years of war and chaos and destruction. I would be really consoled by this. Lots of this sort of stuff. People coming out. And here, there's a Spanish people from Malaga, Las Mujeres, Afghanistan, and some nuestras hermanas, the sort of fists. And then this sort of stuff, like there was people tweeting like the sort of transitions from the kind of modernity to this kind of covering, which must be bad. This is kind of terrible. And these kind of like images of the before and after, the kind of professional woman to the kind of backwards and to the woman who's under the brutality of the Taliban. So, just what can the literature tell me about this? And I suppose this is why my version, I guess, of multimodality is like, what can I say about this? What's already been said? And I think that's a big thing if you want to, for me, the version of multimodality that's about engaging with broader issues like, say, teaching in classrooms or about issues of democracy or racism. What's already known in those academic communities? What is it that we add? Can we add anything or nothing, or are we just like, adding some concepts and colonising it for ourselves? I think certainly if you want to publish outside of, say, our own journals, our own niche journals, then you have to do that. And I think, I'm often impressed and amazed by the depth of knowledge in semiotics that I don't think often linguists who take on multimodality have. But to show the worth of those in the broader academic context needs that you have to know what's already said, or what do we already know. And that can be quite humbling, when you think, you say to the moment I have some new PhD students who want to look at a particular thing, and I've got this great idea, and I think multimodality can do it, and I've read Crescent van Leuven, and then you say, check out if anything's been done on that already. And they say, actually, there's 10 journals on this already, and a whole, in fact, there's like 10 rows of library books. I've read only 2 of them, I'm not sure what I have to say. And I know this is, this, it's mundane, but I think, there's different types of multimodality. There's about theorizing the nature of multimodal communication. There's about, can we model it? Can we create grammars, as we've seen happens also in semiotics? But can we use it as a communication scholars? And I feel like there's a lot of work I've seen so far that you're doing that wants to do that, and we have the skills to contribute something. So just quickly tell you about some of the theories that I come across. Well, this is my wife. She writes on this all the time, and so I picked out a few of the summary things, which is the positive side of political movements and social media movements on social media is that it's transformed all political participation. Activism, not a surprise. So new possibilities for different voices. We all know that. Things like Me Too or Black Lives Matter. These are produced for new voices. People you can't hide anymore from people who are angry about things. It's less easy to hide. And the national news media now have to take this on board because everyone else is sharing anyway. This is kind of good. Hashtags can be extensions of more traditional practices such as lobbying or organising protests, or, which is I think we're dealing with here with this Afghanistan, they can take the form of a more support and solidarity to broader social issues. So I guess I stand by women in Afghanistan. So what do you exactly mean by that? Well, I guess I think it's not a good thing, and I don't like the Taliban. And it's like the guys that on the Jazz website, if you ask them, they don't necessarily know. But clearly, it's about these kind of issues. It allows us to support solidarity, because it's horrific. These things we see can be terrible, they can be horrific. So we can show allegiance. Although there's a lot of criticism and some quite nice examples of, which call this sort of collectivism, and they even distract from civic action. Particularly if newspapers take on a hashtag that's just about making symbolic gestures, that becomes, look, everyone's angry. But if they take on a hashtag, it can recontextualise it away from the actual thing that maybe we should be looking at. All the newspapers are filled with these images and maybe even show the women in Malaga who are raising their fists. But what is it that we may want to have the pictures of so that we can actually do something? Because there are very clear causes for this situation that are usually completely deleted. And there's a number of books I want to look at in a second that point to those. Then some people say symbolic forms of social media activism, like standing by things, are more akin to a form of a lifestyle politics, such as ethical consumerism. And the thing is here that there's not clear political targets or purposes. It may be short-lived, and it's about, I have friends who did stand next to women in Afghanistan, and they also buy fair trade products. They like to eat organic. And, so these just general sort of package of a lifestyle things. They'll take there to buy their children organic clothing. This becomes the way that we create stances against things, like clusters of kind of lifestyle. And it's like, many social media theories have said, this can mean it becomes, it's about individual acts. Doing things for women in Afghanistan isn't about doing things or even discussing it. It's about doing this. It's about, like, I buy this coffee that helps people in Brazil. So such actions can bring a sense of empowerment as people are able to feel they at least act or speak out against matters of concern and justice. And it can raise public consciousness. What kind of discourses do go into consciousness? And I think this is one of the, my wife was telling me, she was texting me and saying, this is like the discussion they're having now in Holland about the political communications people, about what does it mean when politics becomes more and more about gestures, more and more about individual alignments, and I'm angry with this and I'm angry with that, and everyone has their buzzword, everyone has a position, whether it's a right-wing one or a left-wing one, and it's all reduced to a kind of a very symbolic gesture. Well, what does that mean? And then also, for some scholars, however, have questioned the depth and coherence of forms of participation on social media platforms, the affordances of such platforms, and we talked about earlier this morning in one of the groups, the affordances simply work against interpersonal interaction. So, as semioticians, we don't need to do this work. It's already been shown and demonstrated in excellent research projects. If you look at how people talk about something like Afghanistan, it's completely fragmented. It's chaos. They're not saying anything clear. There's no clear causalities. There's no clear problems. And I even saw some nice studies on Me Too, which just that while it raised the public awareness, but within the hashtag itself, it was chaos. There was no clear message, no clear causalities, no clear agents, even no clear victims, which became a big criticism of people in the global south. But the point is, there's not necessarily coherence. It can be good if that can raise public awareness, but what does it mean if that's how we always communicate about things? So we communicate about Afghanistan, not by saying, okay, what happened there? We invaded there, we've been messing about with the place for 40 years. We've been taking our resources, making a fortune, pumping in soldiers and weapons. We don't even talk about that, we just talk about solidarity and standing next to people and making gestures. What does it mean if all political communication becomes kind of like that? And, I think, looking sort of a range of issues just recently, it seems to be that's how things play out. Just following social media in Sweden about something I'm interested in, which is the privatisation of schools in Sweden. And it seems like there's no coherence, no one's identifying, it's all buzzwords. It's all gesturing and it's all abstraction, because no one's listening, no one's paying attention, it's all fast-paced. And if you look at someone who's just done their solidarity for Afghanistan, their next tweet is about picking up their children from the hockey match. The next tweet's about a complaint to a restaurant they were at, an expensive restaurant the previous evening. So, I guess what is this form of political communication? What does it mean? I guess that's what my poem is now talking about. So, as well, you can see, it's quite clear when we were following the feed, the vastness of these posts of people sending their love hearts, and sometimes people even completely misgetting the drift of what's going on. I love that, and then, oh no, I don't. I don't love that. I really hate that. Oh no, I didn't mean that. So it's sort of fast, and it's and people, you can see people supporting people in Afghanistan, why they're waiting to pay for their shopping, and why they're or maybe why they're waiting to fill their car with petrol or something, with ecological petrol. And this is something which I don't know, maybe this is not new. I sort of learned a lot about vernaculars on thinking about these gestures as vernaculars, as this might be boring for you, but so rather than focusing on clearly laid out points or positions, like people like Eckhart and Body are in a relationship in a highly ephemeral way. So they might all be gesturing about the same thing, but they may not agree on anything. So even if, say, it's a right-wing feed or a left-wing feed, maybe there's very little agreement at all. What if you're just communicating through gestures? You don't need to have any agreement, really. We all just agree that doing this is a kind of good thing. So often taken the form of which they say a vernacular symbolism. And I kind of like that. And then Phil Graham, who's a critical discourse analysis, worries that this is kind of means it's almost like a post-literary era. Formerly, maybe, were we more oriented to talking about things in terms of reference points, in terms of concrete communicative rationality, as Habermas would call it. But now, if we all communicate in terms of these vernaculars that crop up. So, I've been following some YouTube alt-right sites just to see what people say, like that Jordan Peterson and these people who fascinate me. And if you listen to what they say, it's just disassembled random ideas. It's just random. And maybe he will pick one crazy thing that someone said about gender politics, one absurd example, and then somehow use that to delegitimize the whole of the left. But it's if you look at the tweet, if you look at the YouTube feed below, it's like what people at Activism would call it's just a vernacular. They've all got these ideas and gestures and symbolisms that they all agree on, but no one's really clear what they even mean. But that doesn't matter. Because they serve a purpose. So there are all these kind of wedge points, so people on the right might help with people on the left. And the thing is, Caliandro and Salmiche, these allow easy recognition and simplification. So it's a bit like the term sustainability. No one knows what it means. if you look at the documentations on sustainability, it seems to be that we can sort of develop the world, build things, increase production, but also save the planet and save humanity. It's a mess. Yeah, but in a way, sustainability has become one of these kind of vernaculars and easy code, which is kind of easily recognisable that like corporations or people can just dip into. So that's the kind of the literature there. A final point, emotional capitalism. I was at a conference where, an online conference where this was I was really fascinated by this. This idea that, which is something I hadn't thought about so much before, but I've become very much aware of it, say, writing papers on institutional communication, say at a university or in a hospital. And all that communication is filled with emotional commitment. If you go to Starbucks, they're not just selling you a coffee, they're doing it for you, they're committed to your community. As teachers, we have to show commitment all the time. According to Louis, emotions have become so highly entwined in everything we do in terms of self-branding, particularly on social media. Also institutions work, our products work, how even services and health services work. It's become, our society has become infused with these engineered forms of emotional expression. And as we see on social media, they often have a performative character. And I know this before I had to end up leave my job in Sweden. It was clear that my, when I had my job appraisal, it seemed more important the emotional commitment that I showed. And it was done on an online form. And it wasn't about the quality of what I did. It was all about my passion, and my passion for the students, and my utter commitment. It was about sort of the performance of these things. And I guess the symbolic gestures like doing this, they're not viewed by the participants of those witnesses as ephemeral, but as being infused by moral and cultural value. And I guess that's why, I go back to my social media feed when I've not looked at it for 3 months, and I see this phase where everyone was angry with me. Not because I'd said anything, because I hadn't said anything, because I hadn't done the right performative gesture. Because it's not just a gesture, it's like, that's the currency that's like we expect now, and they're filled with moral and cultural value. I guess people like feminists, like Blanche Weiser, for example, and I've been reading her stuff, I kind of really like, and maybe you know a lot about already. But she's very much interested in where our social and political landscape becomes so entwined with this moral stance making, and where socio-political issues become sentimentalised, simplified, and recontextualised. And I kind of think that whenever I'm following these different tweets about Afghanistan, I've also been looking on some of the discussions about Iran, or whether I'm looking at like Jordan Peterson and these kind of darker kind of people. It seems to be all about these kind of over-sentimentalised vernaculars, and so everything becomes a buzzword or a kind of t-shirt. And the example that Blanche Weiser gives is the kind of, that everything can become a t-shirt. This is her example. So, it's not about, I was in China, I sit in my office and I can see the area where people, the students are allowed to gather. And there's lots of young students with Futures Female t-shirts on, or variations of this. And I said to my colleague, who's a feminist, this is great. This is great, because clearly there's looking around me in the work environment, this is great. And she says, no. She says, this is the problem. Everything's becoming neoliberalised and individualised. These are elite hand people who already have power to all the resources. They mean they're going to get a good job. That's cool. They want to get a good job. But I guess from the point of view about feminism, like she was arguing, my colleague is Blanche Weiser, these end up being more like symbolic gestures. It's not sure, what do we mean by this? And who means this? What kind of change does that bring about? Or does this, as Blanche Weiser suggests, get in the way of change? In the 90s, people like Lucy Gray said that, the mass need would colonise feminism and colonise lots of other progressive politics. But I guess Blanche Weiser is kind of worried now that, she also mentions the kind of Beyonce kind of thing. the word feminist becomes what? What does it mean? It becomes something we have on a t-shirt. So maybe you can have the t-shirt and to do the gesture at the same time, and drink your fair trade coffee. So I just want to say the situation in Afghanistan, and just what's missing. And this was me, was humbling reading this literature, and it was recommended to me by someone who's been a refugee, who was a refugee, and through conversations with them. And I found this, I was finding kind of quite disturbing reading all of this. So on the one hand, it's been shown that publics and societies in Europe and the US are presented with a highly limited and distorted views of the global South. So, if you sit in Europe, and it's interesting when you kind of try this out on your family. And, I was sitting just a few weeks ago with some family in Mechelen, in Belgium. And, when we were talking, and they were sort of talking about places like Afghanistan and Iran, and only in the context of this creates problems for us. And it was amazing how much the ways that my family had of understanding the whole of the Third World was very, very limited, and a limited number of frames. So, quantitative analysis has shown that the world out of the Third World, the global South, is like either disasters, dictators, famine, or chaotic behaviours. And often in societies that actually have very, very complex and deep and rich cultures and infrastructures. But in the news, these things are often represented out of context. They're not given any necessarily relationship to us and our society. So in the country where there is a famine, it's not got anything to do with the activities of the Global Bank or the IMF fund at the moment, or not. But on the news, this will never ever be brought up. It will just be a random famine, a random dictatorship. It won't be questions, what has this got to do with, say, European and NATO activities? Never questioned. So, and apart from that, coverage tends to represent such events ethnocentrically through a number of typical tropes of difference from Western rationality and democracy. Like uncivilized, hostile, corrupt, badly organised, excessively emotional, irrational and incoherent. So, in a way, when we see Afghanistan, the discourses that already dominate in the mass media, as communication scholars tell us, they're already like this, they're already simplified, they're already kind of lazy, they're already very ethnocentric. So Afghanistan, it's more of this rational stuff, it's more of this uncivilized, hostile, corrupt, and that's what a lot of Afghanistani scholars complain about. You don't even know the first thing about us and our country. And your gestures, that's kind of helping to hide the reality of our country and our situation. One of the biggest, which media communication scholars, one of the biggest representations of conflict and social collapse around the world is children and women. So we shouldn't be surprised then that Afghanistan becomes represented not in terms of its very specific and complex situation, but by women or children. In particular, image of Afghan women and burghers became a key symbol of the need for the intervention, as evidenced by the backward and oppressor of Islam. And that became the kind of, in a way, part of the US legitimisation for going into Afghanistan in the first place. So, in a way, saying I've got solidarity for women, you're kind of aligning with the US policy in the first place, which is what people like these kind of books argue. So, I've read a lot of these books about gender and international aid in Afghanistan, imagining Afghanistan, a lot of ethnographic stuff about the sheer, chaos and the complexity of the situation. And to reduce it to the Taliban, a bunch of Taliban men and women who have burqas is a bizarre ethnocentric representation of a very complex situation, which these people argue is part of the legitimisation of the fact that, if you knew the reality, you would not let your government send all these soldiers there to blow people up and to bomb us. You would not let that happen. So, quickly, the situation in Afghanistan, and for me, if I, as I say, discourse scholar, can contribute anything to this is the most important thing. The women in the burqa becomes the personification of the need to facilitate the transition from the barbaric to the modern empowered citizen, as well as the simplified idea of Western gender politics and victimhood in the face of ignorant and backward patriarchy. So, and this is like scholars who've done like endless ethnographic studies of Afghanistan. And the argument, which is very clear, that the present situation of women in Afghanistan is largely due to the US occupation, rather than despite it. The Americans didn't help them, they created it. And what reading these books, it's often by a guy who understands like military manoeuvres, just the sheer mess that was Afghanistan. And he does some really nice stories about like British troops who were just shooting villages up, just trying to find someone called the Taliban. And the locals are playing games with them, they're the Taliban. And because within all these regions there's competition for resources, competition to take over land, and no one is the Taliban. It's just a kind of argument, it's just a strategy. And so when we say I stand against the Taliban, for many of these people in this country, they won't have ever met anyone called the Taliban. They may have met a number of tribal groups, they may have met a number of people that are not going to be nice to them, but they may have never met Taliban. And also, what these writers show is actually that there's this really nice ethnographic study of women who were actually in the part where people were calling themselves Taliban, and they were oppressed by the Taliban and made to farm by the Taliban, but the Taliban were women. Because like there are women Taliban, the Taliban people have wives. I was sort of like, fell off my chair. But what do you mean? But like, I've seen all these pictures of the Taliban like on the television. But no. This book proceeds to show this world that I have no idea of. This incredibly rich and diverse with complex cultures and complex infrastructures. So, these people are a complete lack of understanding, also the great variety of forms of life that are lived out there. This simplified ideas carried in Western media about women and men in Afghanistan are rather ethnocentric, and I think what these women show or talk about is that how these aid organisations often take these ideas of gender and impose them onto these cultures where they don't fit. But also, what does it mean if you live in a zone where you've been, on the one hand, abused by various invading forces, say, coming over the border from Pakistan, and then bombed by the Americans and then shot to pieces by the British a few weeks afterwards. So, and your sort of men have been drawn into these fights. So you're starving, you're refugees, and you travel across the country. This is an example from the book. And then when you get there, you'll sort of meet this kind of sort of gender, this sort of like, this westernized gender politics. And that's what these people complain about. Right, I just want to quickly just look at how have we got left?
Well, if you want to have at least 10 minutes for questions, we should close in the next 5 minutes.
Yep, okay, yeah. So just like, let me quickly just look at the hashtag. So the hashtag is just filled with lots of drawings, interestingly. So, we see the Taliban kind of attacking, and this is not the analysis I would do in the paper, but just to sort of give you a sample of what goes on. So we see the Taliban throwing rocks at these kind of women who are often alone and isolated or in groups. And one of the arguments of the literature is that women are never, in Afghan society, live in communities with sons and brothers and husbands that work and they need to find ways to survive. But why does this hashtag never represent women with their families? Why does it never represent them with their sons and their children? What does that mean? Or you represent them like looking at women. And women are often, playing a musical instrument or doing something creative. They're sort of showing a sense of their own individualism and development in a way that these authors argue is very ethnocentric. You also see, just random images of people who are labelled as Taliban, which MACHIN goes on about. These are not. No, these are not Taliban. Those are not Taliban. But yet, the Western, on Twitter, what you do not see is things like this. Real families and real places. It's a very decontextualised model of life in Afghanistan. And just to end, I'm following your tradition of having too many slides. I just wanted to just end with this. Wow, that is too many slides. Wow, look at this. Yeah, lots about empowerment. So, and this is really important because like what the literature says is, God damn it with you people and your empowerment and freedom and people protesting and feeling good. You know, we're starving. You know, my son's starving. What do you mean with all these pictures? They're kind of meanings to it. But also, they talk a lot about giving these women voice. And the only tweets say anything other than solidarity are about giving women voice. And one of the authors of one of those books says that, points out that the concept of voices has its traditions in Western European philosophy, Western European thinking. The idea about the individual who develops their own voice. And it's in a society where there are individuals with voices that we can vote, that we can have a democracy, that we can, we should be educated so that we can have voice. And what those authors argue is that in the end, if we talk about this sort of idea of voice, that in itself is a hugely ethnocentric idea that we can transform something that has its own long history of doing things very differently. And it reminds me of Massimo's talk this morning, the sheer incapacity we have to understand these cultures, when we're so laden with our own notions of, of literacy, of politics and identity. So in the end, what we're doing on these hashtags is, we're through these gestures, which I understand, it's about, there's things I'm upset and scared of the world. I'm really sad and terrified of lots of things I see. I want to do things, and I don't buy fair trade coffee, but I think, should I? Should I go into Starbucks? Will I save some people? And the literature says, no, that country's in a structural adjustment program. They're going down. You're not going to save them. But I think about it, and we're in a difficult world and we need solutions. So and it's on the one hand, it raises consciousness, but on the other, what it does is, which I guess the people at the Political Communications Conference would say, is what does that mean if more and more of this very individualized gesture politics, lifestyle politics, becomes like how we do things in society? What does that mean for democracy? And what does that mean about what can be talked about and not talked about? My guess is it'd be very hard to challenge this. It's a bit like, say, in my university where I worked in Sweden. I actually gave a talk because we had this huge grant on sustainability. And I gave a talk criticising the UN document, saying, this is odd, it's got no clear causality, it's a mess. And I was just dismissed as being, negative, And I'm never negative, never. But you can't say it. It was almost, no, because we have to be for these things. And as we've seen on social media now, which I found, just by my lack of attention to social media, I'm often attacked for not taking the right and dominant moral stances. And you can sort of see, if you look at Jordan Peterson on the one hand, and I've got some trendy left people I watch on YouTube on the other, and they've got their own buzzwords, their own vernaculars, and they just police their echo chambers for people to follow with the vernaculars. I mean, in terms of sort of semiotics and multimodality, what can I add to this? That's the question. Is simply analytical discourse analysis, because we can ask who's missing, what ideas and values are foregrounded, and what's missing, what's visually foregrounded, and what's missing, what kind of actions, what participants are missing or present. And if we look a bit more carefully at this, say this or the UN document of sustainability, there's problems, and I think as communications scholars we can look in detail at communication in ways that these people can't. And we can just show, there's no agents here, but here there's lots of agents. Why is that? Here we see pictures of people who are called the agents, but they don't seem to match with the language. What's that about? And that's what we contributed with our studies to racism as well, when we turn up to these policy meetings. I think these sort of very small things are appreciated. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions and comments. Who would like to start?
Sorry, I want to ask not about the problem, but about the results of this process, because you know that in the 20th century there are many protests, social protests, like the to freedom for the Angela Davis, to Nelson Mandela, and so on. But in they were the results of this protest, because something changes in political space. But nowadays there are many social protests, but no the results. This is the changing of the political space at all.
Well, I think that's a really important point that most of the scholars say. There's on one hand, like social media can be used for very specific, concrete things. There is a problem. Can we mobilise to solve that thing there that we can see and identify clearly? But then there's this kind of sort of lifestyle kind of politics where maybe the causes and solutions aren't all that clear, or you align with it. And it seems to be that people who know social media literature better than I, about this kind of way that everything becomes about that lifestyle, individualism, about the you, rather than the world out there.
David, I wanted to ask you, given that social media is not going to go away, can you imagine a more useful incarnation of social media that would encourage deeper thought and activism, or do you see the medium itself as the problem?
I could write a book on the answer. I guess one of the things that interests me is the transition to, let's say, which I'm seeing a lot in China, which is what my feminist colleagues said to me. These students, they're not talking about changing society, it's about them. And it's about, them, like the idea of their identity at the heart of, like, I'm ambitious, I'm competitive, the sort of neoliberal identity, we all compete and we all struggle for resources, society, the government retreats, everything becomes privatised. We run societies like a market. And I guess for me, we could only have this, and we can only have this if we had neoliberalism. And maybe, we can only have neoliberalism because we have social media. And I'm not exactly sure, I'd like to write that out. And actually, I'm saying this, it's a sort of conversation with I'm going to blame Paul Cobley, who's my co-editor, who's not here. I just stole his words. But it's a kind of discussion we've been having, and shall we write the book on it? So thanks for bringing up that nugget. Thank you.
What do you think about performativity?
But what do I think about it?
That's from you. Performativity.
Yeah. Well, I guess, to be honest, I've become aware of reading the literature that, a lot of the, people like, is it Paparisti, who talk about, social media, that, it's more about now effect, about how I feel, rather than what I know, rather than concrete arguments. And I guess, when I came across this literature on performative capitalism, I became to think about, the sort of heart of performativity, or the heart of these kind of gestures, the idea of emotional commitment. It's also something that Foucault saw at the heart of neoliberalism. That you have to somehow internalise these values. You can no longer just work, you have to work with passion. As a sort of hospital can no longer just say, now I pointed this out to my children at a local hospital, I went for injections. They can't just treat you, they have to care. They have to do it with passion. And I was in my daughter, is it good that they do it with passion? To my daughter, and she was saying, why do they have to be passionate now? And I guess this is important now, this idea of the performativity, emotions become a capital themselves, almost like a moral obligation. And I don't know, and I'd love to hear what people like, some of the conversations I heard earlier today, what semioticians would talk about this, and I would really like to have that conversation. And you'll probably tell me that as well.
If I may myself, but I profit by my position here. I think that I completely agree with your discourse about having to reconstruct the cultural context of what passes as an announcement for generic involvement in social action. This image on the left, for instance, in Farsi is non kar azadi, which is actually not food work freedom, it is bread work freedom. And it's a big difference because this is a typical sign of the left-wing parties like Today or other parties that are a protagonist of social struggles in Iran or Afghanistan, and do not focus only on the rights of women, but also on a whole economic structure, which is not exactly the one that is endorsed by the capitalist system. So, it is important to, as you said, go into the details to see what is behind the message. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wilson? Any other comments or questions? Another proper question I had is that I think you showed many ads, but I think an important distinction is to be made between this announcement where people use the verb stand for,
yes,
and the announcements in which they use the verb pray. Because when they use the verb pray, the question is, but pray who?
Yeah.
So which God are you going to pray?
Yeah.
The Christian God to save?
Yeah. And this is as, again, like as a communication scholar, you sit at a policy meeting and these are some of the comments that, the detail. Is the one.
Okay. Sorry.
I was just wondering what you think about identity or multimodality of identity. We can think about that when the digital persona of one is somehow different from the physical one. As for example, as I lived this sort of participant when Russian-Ukrainian war started, many people I know who would be from Georgia or Ukraine, or just to express their solidarity with Ukraine, they would post something like this to all Russians on their Instagrams and Facebook, like let's destroy terrorist state, very harsh statements. And then knowing that I'm Russian, for example, they would communicate with me like just normal, but they express very strong opinions online. And personally, I felt confused. But for them, everything was right. They were standing with Ukrainians. So what do you think about these behaviors?
I think someone brought up, I think someone who put it, you put it really well in one of the other sessions about, about sort of trolling and that whole, possibilities, that brings, and I have a friend who wanted to be an influencer, but it failed partly because they got trolled. They got trolled by someone. It turns out that they knew them. And they were like 10-year-old kids that trashed. And they had this. It was going really well. And actually, they became a bit unbearable because they became the personification of the Instagram person. And even walk. Because in the videos, how they. I'm not going to do it, but they had a sort of walk. An attitude. But yeah, that's. I guess that's as much as far as my reflection goes on that. But again, I guess I would want to know, who's talking about this in which literature and how, which you probably have done. You've done the literature search, and then what bits can we bring to that as to what's going on in the communication that we can say something interesting. I thought what Massimo just said about this, about what parts of actions are missing. There's lots of sort of transitive actions on these, but with no goal. We're just doing things, or actions are represented as nominalizations and not as verbs. So you can be doing things, you can be striving. Striving for what? So there's a whole set of those about Afghanistan. They're striving. You think, but what? And I know in my personal assessment over at university, I had to be striving for lots of things. But all the Afghanistanians striving for the same things, for internationalisation, for sustainability, to increase student numbers. It doesn't say. And I guess that's, for me, is what does the literature tell us already in the scholarship, and what can we as communication scholars add to that?
And on that, I think multimodality scholars, critical discourse scholars, and semioticians can really join their forces. So, but please join me also to thank you, Professor MACHIN, for this wonderful